Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dojo Live. My name is Kim Lantis, and I'm airing live from Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico. Joining me is my teammate and co-host, Carlos Ponce. Hey,
Good to be
Carlos.
here.
I
Good
forget
to
where
be
you're
here.
at. You're not at home in Cuernavaca. Where are you?
Cancun.
Okay. Poor guy. You poor guy. How you suffer.
It's, you can't stand the pain. Yeah.
And of course, the main reason why we're here today is our guest. I'm pleased to introduce Raj Singh, who is the CEO and co-founder of Pulse. Thank you so much for joining us today, Raj.
Thanks, Kim, and Carlos for letting me participate.
No, it's our pleasure for sure. So today
Absolutely.
we're going to be talking about remote work, something that we've all felt, I think, very acutely, especially over the past 2+ years. Before we get into that, however, Raj, please, can you tell us a bit about yourself, your story, who you are, what makes you tick, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. I'm a father of 2 kids, family based in the Bay Area. I live across the street from the Apple spaceship. So got to see that from development. There was a bunch of drones flying out of my neighborhood right when those became available while that was being built. But I've been doing startups my whole career. I call it a blessing and a curse. I almost feel like I don't know how to do anything else. I actually dropped out of master's in 2000 to start my first company. I saw what was happening with the dot-com boom, and I'm like, I need to participate in this. Certainly, not necessarily the best time to drop out of master's with the crash happening literally months after, but started a file sharing network. That's kind of where I started my career. Back then, things were very different. You didn't have all of the resources that you have today. And you didn't really have internet, so to speak, in terms of like incubators and accelerators and whatnot. And so we hustled. They won a business plan competition, used that to meet investors, tried to raise money. It was a really interesting journey, but that's kind of where I started. And then since then, I've just been building my own stuff. I tend to focus on things that are personal pain points. And so I kind of went from figuring out how to download and steal more music with file sharing to I built a dating site and then later a ringtone site because I wasn't happy with the ringtones on my phone. And then my now wife was based in England, and so I was doing live mobile video before the iPhone, and then just kind of keeps going and going and going. And obviously today, we're going to talk about what I'm working on now in a bit. Let's see, I do jujitsu. It's sort of one of my hobbies in my free time. I like practically everyone, of course, like traveling to new places, not as much as I used to. I'm sort of increasingly enjoying comfort of predictable places. But definitely my wife is a foodie. So we're always cooking up random and interesting things. I actually used to have a recipe company. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the short story. I mean, we'll talk about
very, very interesting. You make me laugh about not traveling as much as we used to. I recently saw a meme, something about your childhood punishment becoming your adult goals, like staying home, going to bed early, things like that.
Yeah. I have a 2-year-old and I have a 9-year-old, and there's just the effort to travel with them is just it ruins all of the travel.
Hang on, the 2-year-old's gonna come up.
I hear you.
Yeah.
You want to keep them, in the same time zone and school and whatnot, and so
Perfect.
It's kind of shifted from random places to let's just go to an all-inclusive resort for 5 days and come back.
Yes. So let's talk about these pain points and what the pain point was that led to your current company, which is Pulse. Who is Pulse? What are you all about these days?
Yeah, so Pulse. So I'm sure many people who are either listening to this yourselves have at some point used some chat application, whether it's ICQ from the 90s or AOL Instant Messenger or Slack and Microsoft Teams, whatnot. And I'm sure all of you have noticed the green dot, that sort of status. And that status is something that actually hasn't changed in 20 years. Actually, I looked at early screenshots of ICQ. You can't install it anymore. I suppose if you can find an old machine, you may be able to pull it off. But you can only set available, away. It's the exact same experience it is today. But today, we're distributed. We're hybrid. It's the future of work. It's different. We're not all in the office. And that green dot is no longer serving its purpose. We'll hear from teams talking about, I have no idea who's around. It feels lonely working from home. I feel less connected to my teammates. And so what we've done with Pulse is we have built automatic status. And we have a lot of data that shows that through automating and making that status more contextual and richer, not only you feel more free and in control of your day, but it significantly improves workplace culture. It improves sort of team connectedness, bonding, and whatnot. The idea actually started from my last company. I actually had a smart calendar called Tempo. This is like in the days when calendars on the phones were really, really bad. And it was acquired by Salesforce, and we were a partially distributed team. So I had maybe half my team here in the Bay Area, and the other half were spread across the US as well as abroad. And after we had joined Salesforce at the time, super in-office culture, they didn't really, it wasn't remote first. I'm sure a lot of people know what that means now, maybe not back then.
Of course.
And so what they would do is they would fly in our remote teammates into the office 1 week every month. And when they were there, they felt super connected, energized, but then when they weren't there, they felt disconnected. And so I was thinking, after I'd left Salesforce, I took some time off, but I was thinking a lot about that problem. How can we make distributed teams feel more connected? And that's sort of where Pulse started. And then obviously COVID just sort of accelerated this trend from a category into a layer. Everybody knows and understands remote now. And so I feel like the timing of all this has worked out really well.
Well, that's great. Congratulations on that. So we're going to get diving in deeper to that topic in just a moment. But Carlos, what is the topic for today's conversation? Oh, you're muted, Carlos. There we go.
Is that so, Kim? I mean, how can it be? How can it be any different? How can I not be muted? That's my trademark. You see me like gesturing, and it's always on mute. Anyway,
have you guys seen that bingo image of all the Zoom errors that can occur?
Yeah. You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And you're still screen sharing. Where is John?
The inevitable dog barking, which is going to happen probably for me any moment. Fortunately, my daughter's at preschool today, so there's not going to be the child interrupting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all have our share of anecdotes. I have my own, Kim does too. But let's talk about the topic. The topic as chosen by our guest today is, of course, the future of remote work. We're going to be answering the question, is the office anachronistic and from a pre-digital age? So let's start there, Raj. Please tell us and the audience, why did you choose this particular topic? Why did you, I mean, maybe I don't need to ask this, but why did you feel personally that it was relevant for today's day and age?
I think there's been a number of interesting surveys that have happened over the last 2 years in asking employees, how do you feel about remote work? And it's shifted. Google sort of published, not published, sort of data around how their employees felt in the first 3 months when COVID initially struck. A lot of them wanted to return to the office. By month 9, month 12, a lot of them didn't want to return. By month 18, 20, it kind of shifted back a little bit towards the median. What a lot of employees are seeking is flexible work options. And that may include remote, that may include being in the office some bit or when they choose to be. But really what's happening and what's been interesting, in my opinion, has been this grand experimentation. There is still not a one prescribed sort of approach or philosophy that companies are saying this will yield the best output in terms of both team culture and bonding and productivity. And so I just think in terms of timing, with sort of the pandemic moving to an endemic and offices reopening, this conversation is particularly timely because people are returning back to the office. That exact question, I don't take credit for. I saw it on Twitter just a few days ago. It's from Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb. He tweeted that out. And this was in the context of his rationale of Airbnb going fully distributed forever, or allowing fully remote forever. But I think there is a lot of debate around that, and there's a number of people you talk to who think companies that go fully distributed will underperform, and we just don't simply have the data, which is part of the problem.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your response. So
Yeah,
I got my own.
good. Pardon,
Yeah,
I was just
absolutely.
going to say that's a good point of not having the data. And I'd like to. I have a question for you after your question, Carlos. So please go ahead.
No. Well, actually, I was thanking Raj for this. Raj, I have many questions because for a lot of reasons. Okay, one of them is that we have been remote. I personally, because of my role, I've been remote for a lot of for longer than 2 years, right? So I'm kind of used to the remote setting. I am the only one from my team who's like working at a very distant location than where everybody else. So I'm kind of familiar. However, I'm sure that, and I see this in our internal channels, is that a lot of people are craving going back to the office, right? So it's like, so my personal take is, to the way I see it, is the future of remote work is somewhere in the middle. Let's meet somewhere in the middle. So my question is, in this transition to finding or striking a balance, what would you say would be the components of remote work that are going to suffer the most? Is it going to be like technological challenges? Is it going to be psychological, mental? Where are the greatest challenges for striking a balance in the future of remote work?
Yeah, and before I answer that, I am going to say, these are my opinions, so feel free to just debate me, because you guys have been working remotely for a long time. So I think a lot of the data points at when you return people back to the office, inevitably the culture becomes office first. And it's hard to control that. There's a set of best practices in trying to maintain a remote first culture. When you're physically in the office, like for example, if you're joining a video conference, everybody take it from their own computer, but that just seems so inefficient when you're in an office. If you're having hallway chats, please try to write them down so you can share it asynchronously to those that can't participate. Possibly even having cameras that are visible into the office so remote people can see who's around and what's happening or what's going on. There's been a number of sort of different innovations and tweaks and takes on how to try to make remote team members feel more included. However, the reality is, when you're physically at the office, and in part why I started Pulse, your presence is your status. When people think of status, they think of availability, but seeing you're wearing a Golden State Warriors t-shirt would indicate to me that you're probably a fan. Seeing that you are wearing headphones would indicate to me that you're focused. A lot of those signals are lost when you're remote, and the data is out. It's very clear that over the last 2 years during this experiment of fully distributed teams, people were feeling more disconnected, particularly outside of their core team. People felt less team bonding. It's unclear if innovation took a spike. That's something that they're still trying to measure. And one thing I do often say to people is that over the last 2 years, a lot of the largest companies were executing product roadmaps that were built from when they were in the office, right? So now we're finally entering a cycle where they actually have to build new product roadmap. And so, there's still a lot of just unknown data. But I guess my point is, trying to maintain remote first while having an office can be very difficult unless management moves out. And even then can be difficult because being seen is considered being there. And there's just a psychological assumption around being seen and getting work done. Even if you move into sort of a Matt Mullenweg 5, layers of the remote work triangle to achieve like true asynchronicity, it's just not the case. And I would say one interesting data point, at the very onset of the pandemic, a lot of my, let's call it remote work influencers, so like the old school remote work peeps, the peeps pre-COVID, the Buffers, the Envisions, the companies that were fully distributed and they were on the sort of talking circuit about how this was the future, they were making big bets that the whole world and industry would move asynchronous, and we would be hiring in a globally distributed fashion. But that's not what we've seen. Over the last 2 years, what we've seen is an increase in distributed hiring, but all within similar time zones. Generally, at least with U.S. companies, it's still mostly within the U.S. And what that indicates to me is, even though they've gone remote, they are prioritizing a synchronous culture. And synchronous cultures better lend themselves to in-office work because you're kind of all there at the same time.
Right.
And so, in some ways, to achieve or to force upon a remote-first culture, you almost need globally distributed, because then you're forced to go very asynchronous. But very few companies have really ever pulled that off, and particularly none of them have really done it at any major scale. They're all sort of sub 1,000 for the most part. So I probably just went through a whole range of different topics to trigger a bunch of follow-up questions, but definitely we're entering another experiment. We went from all in office to fully distributed, and now we're going into hybrid and fully distributed option. And let's see how this plays out, because there are really two scenarios at the end of this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Raj. Kim.
Speaking to my personal experience, I think what you displayed in the data that you just shared with us is just this reality that's not going to change. And that's, we are people, we are humans. There's something within our DNA that requires community and just this thriving off the energy of others. And I don't know if that's ever anything that we'll fully be able to experience without, some type of physical contact, at least on occasion. But I think too, as we're transitioning back to this like flexible model or hybrid model, people are still figuring it out, right? Like at the beginning, when we were all sort of forced to go remote with the pandemic, there was just sort of confusion and exhausting. And how are we going to do this? And schools are closed. And oh my gosh, I'm doing 10,000 things at once. And now, schools are back open and things are sort of starting to stabilize. But I think we're kind of in this phase of, okay, what's most comfortable for me? And working with a company that allows for that flexibility, how am I making this work? Right. And so I think it's just like you said, a big petri dish right now, one giant experiment, and we as individuals are sort of experimenting within a community, and it's interesting.
And I think, to follow up on something you said that I think is super important, pre-COVID, when I joined a company, I chose a company because I liked their workplace culture. So I joined that company. They're an in-office culture. That was something I was okay with, and I liked their culture, and I joined the company. I'm somebody who looked for I'm somebody who looked for a fully distributed team, and so I looked for fully distributed team companies, and I joined their team because I like their culture, whatnot. What's happening now is the people who may have joined the company may not intersect with what the company culture wants to be, and so if this company is saying, hey, we want to be, let's say you're Apple, which is really pushing hard to sort of bring everyone back. Even Facebook, although they say there's a fully distributed option, there's a lot of team and peer pressure to sort of come back. They will self-select people that they hire that are comfortable with that culture. And then there'll be companies that operate in more of a fully distributed fashion, and they'll self-select individuals and people who are comfortable with that culture. It's going to take some time before we can make a statement like this approach is better than that approach. And there's a lot of heuristics, or not heuristics, but there's a lot of different things we got to measure it on. It's beyond sort of, employee happiness, but there is also, at the end of the day, productivity output, innovation, retention rates, employee retention rates, things like that. We have this great resignation going on. A lot of people talk about it possibly being due to salaries, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think the problem is video communications are very transactional, and so there's just frankly no bonding with your team, and so you have almost two competing theories going on right now about why we should reopen the office. You have or how to maximize retention. You have one theory that says we need to offer a remote option to retain our employees. You have another theory that says we need to get everyone back in the office. Otherwise, we're going to lose those employees anyways because they feel disconnected. And so it's almost like, so I am eager to see what these next 2 years sort of look like. Another thing that kind of just throws in another wrench into this whole calculus is we simply don't have a lot of data um, on how remote, fully distributed teams perform when team morale is down. Because a lot, the last 2 years have been growth markets from a public market perspective. People are crushing, people are executing product plans. Now we're potentially entering a recession. And so it's shifting from maybe an employee's market to an employer's market. But also it could be a market where maybe companies are contracting. They're not growing. So morale is down because their stock market, their stock based compensation is down and whatnot. And InVision is an interesting example worth looking at again, because they went from like 1,200 employees down to 200 employees, and to what extent being fully distributed hindered their ability to innovate fast enough because of sort of morale, just because they're fully distributed in a time when they really needed to be next to each other because they weren't doing so well. When you're doing well, almost everything works.
So let's talk a bit about Pulse. What is it that your tech and what it is that you're doing to help maybe simulate this we're next to each other type?
Yeah, and I think
perspective or sensation.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's not just about necessarily simulating working side by side. It's beyond that, in the sense that giving the employee more control and more freedom. So if you want to signal that kind of environment, you can, but if you want to use it in a completely different way, you can as well.
Cool.
We asked, and as you alluded to earlier, a lot of people were missing sort of serendipity, side by side, whatnot chat, and there was a ton of innovation over COVID with new startups trying to sort of attack that problem. And you kind of fast forward 2 years and you look at who the real winners are. You have Slack, that's really grown. You have Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Discord, Google Workspace. I mean, these are the obvious winners, but collectively, they went from, I don't know, tens of millions, low hundreds of millions to many hundreds of millions of daily active users. It's insane in terms of their sort of volume. And when you ask people, what do you think of as your virtual office or your digital office? Most people will say it's my Slack or it's my Microsoft Teams. If I need to go ask a question, I go there. If I need to see if somebody's around, I go there. But status is really, really dull. And so
I never even pay attention to it, to be honest.
Because 99% of people don't update it, and it's just a green dot, right? And then you have that intersected with the fact that 98% of these companies are still maintaining a synchronous first culture. That green dot is not really very helpful at all. And so what we have done is we have tried to empower employees and the company. If they want to make that green dot a way to better share availability, they can, around their work day. But it could also be a better way to share fun. If they want to connect their Spotify and share the music they're listening to, they can do that. If they want to connect their Fitbit and share every time they hit their walking goal for the day, they can do that. Versus just their sort of calendar or their different tools or whatever they use, depending on how they want to configure it. The other thing that we've also tried to improve upon, which has become a real issue over the pandemic, is just notifications. And part of the reason notifications kind of exploded is because we're not side by side. And so what used to be like asking a quick question or looking over or walking down the hallway has now just become a barrage of Slack notifications. And there is this sort of mammoth effort of how can I protect my focus time? How can I protect time to get stuff done and not feel like I'm constantly being interrupted and I can't get in the flow of anything? And so with Pulse, we have a number of features that try to figure out when you're focused. You can add focus in your calendar. And just sort of based on how you all sort of configure it, it will intelligently update your status accordingly throughout the day, so you feel like you're in better control.
The way I see it, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it is that you have all these great tools to be communicated, to be connected, to collaborate. But these are technological tools that have a power of its own. However, on the other end of the spectrum is the user, the person who's using these tools. And I think there's a lot of, let's call it education, that the person needs to go through so that these tools can be used correctly. Because let me just give you an example. There's I know that on Slack, for example, you might have these people who constantly have the need to use the channel or the here notification, which we all when it's really not needed. So to me, it's a matter of, hey, I'm in control. I feel the need to communicate this right now, but maybe it's not necessary. So there's a problem. It's a conundrum because there's this bunch of distractions, as you mentioned, as you put it, Rush. So is there a way that we can, maybe through Pulse or some other way, to recommend or to curate these types of notifications so that we're all not that distracted? I mean, we're already distracted as it as it gets these days. So how do we curate distractions? How do we curate all these tools to use them properly?
Well, I do think one thing you did see over the pandemic is at the beginning there was a surge of interest in, like, every team should have a head of remote. Or a head of head of workplace, or some kind of people operations, HR related sort of title to focus on best practices around enabling fluid remote work, minimize distractions and whatnot. And most of that has been folded into people ops and HR now. It's not kind of a dedicated remote title. So certainly companies, as part of their company culture, have to create some best practices. And sometimes that's office hours, sometimes that's respecting each other's time zones, things like that. But the thing is, a lot of that information doesn't exist in your digital office, in your Slack. It's in other web pages, you have to go to another tool to see, like, okay, what's the best way to reach this person? You have to go to another tool to figure out if it's a holiday in their country or a time zone or whatnot. And so those are just examples of things that we just try to bring into status, right? So we just, as part of automatic status, we bring that in there. All that being said, at the end of the day, you're going to continue to have teammates that want to be seen. And so they're going to tag a lot of people. They're going to post in public channels. This is the way, this sort of need to show that I'm working versus being measured on what I get done. And so this is a challenge, and it's a workplace culture thing. And I think it's important to recognize the difference between a small company that's 10 people versus 100 versus tens of thousands. It's going to be very different. And some people's Slacks are like 5,000-10,000 people large, right? And so they're massive. And so they have almost all their communications are in private channels. They're not even using public channels anymore. So I think what we have done with Pulse is we sort of said, let's give you some control. So instead of, given that there's going to be instances where this is going to happen, maybe you can configure it in a way that you notifications are snoozed when you're in deep work, or it's set to away mode when you're in a calendar meeting, or if you're screen sharing or something like that. And so you can really set up and configure it how you want. It's sort of really taking that status and kind of blowing it up 10x.
Very cool. And this is a way where I, as the user, get to configure. It's a kind of one-time. Well, I mean, obviously you can reconfigure, but this is what I think I want. I put it in, and then I can just ignore it.
You can set it and forget it, but it's the type of thing where we have found people often there's so much you can do. You can create rules out of your calendar, and you might want to start expressing yourself in interesting ways. So you can really use really cool emojis to represent different things. And one thing I will say is when a team starts adopting a tool like this, it does also change people's behaviors. Because now I'm less likely to want to interrupt somebody if I see that they're in deep work right now. And so maybe I'll send the message, but I'll send it on a schedule. Like I'll schedule to send the message for later in the day, or something like that. And so you see kind of a win-win on both sides. Obviously, we don't want, I think if you talk to the folks at Slack, they would probably argue that, well, you really should be using Slack asynchronously anyways. There should not be any expectations out of Slack. But the reality is, a lot of companies operate in kind of a synchronous fashion, and depending on workplace culture, there is an expectation for more immediate sort of responses, or depending on what role or team or group you're in. And so this helps mitigate a lot of that.
It's interesting to see what you're saying, contrary to what Slack might think. The users are demanding something beyond their initial intent or what they created their tool to be.
Well, and I think Slack themselves have also acknowledged it, right? They've invested a lot into Slack huddles, trying to enable more synchronous communication. And you're seeing a convergence in sort of even user experience between Slack teams and Google Workspace and even Zoom, what they're doing with Zoom Chat and Zoom.
Very cool. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, Raj. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time today. It does fly. But before we do say goodbye, we do have one more question. And that's to speak specifically to Pulse and your company culture. What is it about you that makes you special? What would encourage others to maybe come look to work with your company? And how have you adapted to this new remote, non-remote world we live in?
I think how there's three questions there, really. What I would say is it's really fun to work on products where people might send you emails saying, I love the product. That is like some of the best feelings you can possibly have when you're working on a product, is to get direct user feedback saying, this is awesome. I'm loving this. Can you add this? Can you add that? I mean, particularly when you're building a SaaS enterprise kind of product, you're selling to teams, but you're getting consumer-like feedback. And that's really cool. And so definitely those that are thinking about remote work, and, we have to cater to all audiences. We have to cater to company cultures that are completely in office. You're seeing that a lot in Asia. Different organizations, Apple might be heading in that direction. We have to cater to organizations that are fully distributed, organizations that are globally distributed. And so we get to talk to a lot of these different companies all over the world, and a lot of different company cultures. And so we're constantly getting new and interesting insights. So I think that's sort of what's attractive about Pulse. I know you had one other question though.
How are you as a company working through this strange remote, not remote time?
Yeah. So, I'll be honest, so most of our team, we started in the Bay Area, and we're not super large. We're 10 people. And so a chunk of our team is based in and around the Bay Area. We do have some folks in Canada and the Midwest. And we, last year in June, decided to optionally use a WeWork, basically a co-working space. One day every 2 weeks. We moved it to one day every week, and it was optional if you wanted to come in, those that were local. And part of it is because it's a long drive for some people. It's like an hour and a half, and just where everyone's based. And my brutally honest thing is I leave those days probably not getting as much stuff done, but I feel super energized. And it's great to spend that lunch with the team and just catch up on things outside of work. And so you're right. You said it at the beginning of the meeting. I don't know how to replicate that through digital tools. I don't think it can. And I think a lot of these remote work companies are trying to invest in figuring out how to create get-togethers once a quarter or whatnot. But it's a non-trivial thing, and getting the timing to align and all the different locations, and even the cost. If you're a smaller company, it can be extremely cost prohibitive. The cost of renting a space could actually even be cheaper. Envision, I think at one point, spent 10 or 20 or 30 million to bring their team together, which is insane. Definitely enjoying that. So I guess you could say we're operating in hybrid. It's totally optional, but most of the people want to come. And we can finally sort of bring our remote team back together to do a larger group gathering. We haven't done that yet because of different countries and different COVID travel restrictions and whatnot. And so I'm looking forward to setting up something later this summer.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. That's great. We wish you nothing but success for Pulse and you as a person as well. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and learning from you today. Stick around for just a moment as we go off air. Carlos, any final words?
Well, usually, Raj, we announce what's coming, but tomorrow we don't have a show because we have the all hands, as you know, Kim. So we're not running a show tomorrow. So this is going to be the only show there. I think, Kim, that we do have a design thinking one, but it's yet to be confirmed in stone, but I mean,
Right.
it
So
was
we'll
booked.
keep you on your
We don't have
toes.
the info.
Tune in at 10
Yeah,
o'clock
yeah,
tomorrow morning
exactly.
to see.
Just tune in at 10 o'clock. If it's there, it's there. If it's not, we'll see you next week. And of course, there's the recap show that we do on Mondays, in which we recap everything we did the week before. Well, which in this case, it was
We'll talk all
this
about
week.
you, Raj.
Right? We'll talk about you. We'll talk about
Thank you
you
for all
and
the
Pulse for
shameless
10 whole
self-plug.
minutes. For 10 minutes as a recap. And that's what we have, Kim. And of course, I want to thank Raj for having joined us today on the show.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.